He was handsome, he was charming, he was well-spoken, a law student, a boyfriend, even a volunteer at a crisis hotline.
So how did Ted Bundy, a man who looked like someone you'd trust to walk your sister home, become one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history? This isn't just a story of what he did, it's a story of how it happened from the inside. Because what makes Bundy's case so chilling isn't just the violence, it's the psychology. The disconnect between the mask and the man. The terrifying calm behind the chaos, and the subtle shifts in thought, identity, and emotion that slowly unraveled behind closed doors long before anyone knew. In this video, we're not here to sensationalize, we're here to understand. To trace the internal evolution of a man who once blended into society and ultimately tore through it. So the question is, what breaks inside a person before they break the world around them? Let's begin. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy was connected to a string of disappearances and deaths that spanned multiple U.S. states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. The victims were mostly young women, many of them college students. And while each case carried its own haunting story, investigators began noticing a pattern. The women often vanished in broad daylight, from public spaces, with no signs of struggle. Bundy's ability to remain undetected allowed him to cross state lines, freely changing cars, jobs, even identities. His charm and intelligence gave him access. His planning gave him control. And his calm demeanor kept him under the radar far longer than anyone imagined. It wasn't until his final crimes in Florida, including a brutal attack inside a college sorority house, that the veil began to slip. Eventually, Ted Bundy was arrested, tried, and convicted of multiple murders. He received 3 death sentences in the state of Florida. On January 24, 1989, he was executed in the electric chair. But this story isn't just about his crimes. It's about the man behind them. Because before any of this became public, there were signs. Subtle ones, psychological ones. And that's where we go next. Before his name became infamous, Theodore Robert Bundy lived a life that on the surface looked ordinary, even enviable. Born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy was raised by his grandparents, and for much of his early life believed his mother was his sister. It was a complicated beginning, but one that wouldn't draw immediate concern from most. He eventually moved to Tacoma, Washington, where he attended high school and later enrolled in the University of Washington to study psychology. By the mid-1970s, he was known as an intelligent and articulate student. He volunteered at political campaigns, even worked at a suicide crisis hotline, a job that ironically had him helping others at their darkest moments. He had girlfriends, friendships, and goals. He spoke of law school and a future in public service. To many who met him, Bundy was polite, soft-spoken, well-mannered. But beneath that polished surface was someone who felt different, disconnected, and as we'll explore, driven by something far more complex than ambition. Because Bundy didn't just hide from the world, he hid from himself. And that journey from isolation to deception began long before the headlines. Next, we explore his psychological roots. To understand Ted Bundy's mind, we have to begin with his early years, where perception, secrecy, and identity first began to fracture. Bundy was born to an unwed teenage mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, in 1946. At the time, being a single mother carried deep social stigma. To protect the family's image, Bundy was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. That single lie, seemingly protective, planted a seed of confusion about his identity. And as he grew older, the eventual revelation of this truth would reportedly shake him to his core. Accounts from those years vary. Some describe Bundy as shy and socially awkward. Others recall charm and intelligence from a young age. But what's consistent is this: he struggled to connect, emotionally distant, secretive, and often described by classmates as someone who simply didn't seem quite present. Bundy later admitted to feeling different from other children. He spoke of not understanding human relationships and of hiding dark thoughts from an early age. He also displayed early signs of voyeurism and was drawn to graphic crime literature in adolescence. There's no public record of physical abuse, but there are strong suggestions of emotional neglect, unresolved identity confusion, and possibly even early conduct issues that went unnoticed or unaddressed. According to forensic psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis Bundy, exhibited signs consistent with antisocial and narcissistic personality traits, marked by charm manipulation, lack of empathy, and a shallow emotional life. Bundy's early life didn't scream danger, but it whispered dysfunction. And those whispers would soon turn into something louder. Next, we examine the psychological triggers and turning points, the events that may have flipped the switch inside him. A person's descent into darkness rarely happens overnight. For Ted Bundy, it appeared to come in waves, subtle changes, emotional ruptures, and quiet resentments that deepened over time. One of the most frequently cited psychological turning points in Bundy's early adulthood was his relationship with a young woman during college. She was wealthy, elegant, and came from a privileged background, everything Bundy, in his quiet insecurity, aspired to be. At first, the relationship seemed promising, but ultimately she left him allegedly because she felt he lacked direction, ambition, and social polish. The breakup cut deep, not just because it was romantic rejection, but because it attacked the very image Bundy was trying to create for himself. He later confessed that her rejection had a profound effect on his psyche, and after this heartbreak, a shift began. Bundy threw himself into self-improvement, re-enrolling in school, gaining acceptance to law programs, and rebuilding the image he once lacked. But underneath that self-discipline was something darker, a growing belief that people, especially women, could be manipulated, controlled, discarded. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming power over his sense of worth, his identity, and the deep emotional void he never addressed. According to clinical psychologist Dr. Al Carlisle, who interviewed Bundy extensively during his incarceration, these formative experiences likely triggered what's known as narcissistic injury, a severe blow to the ego that can cause deep psychological fragmentation in individuals with fragile self-esteem. Bundy didn't outwardly spiral after the breakup. He got quieter, smarter, and more practiced at wearing the mask. Behind it, his worldview was changing. What once was shame became strategy. What once was loneliness became control. And what once was heartbreak became hatred. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It didn't come with a scream or a shatter. It came quietly, like a curtain falling. Somewhere in the mid-1970s, between law school applications and cross-country moves, Ted Bundy stopped pretending, even to himself. Friends noticed he was withdrawing. He lost interest in school. He dropped out and began spending long hours alone, driving, watching, waiting. But the most telling sign wasn't what he did. It was what he no longer felt. Bundy once described standing in front of a mirror, looking into his own eyes and feeling nothing, no guilt, no fear, no sense that the line between thought and action still mattered. His voice calm, his gaze empty. It was like someone else had taken over, he later said. But the truth was darker, that someone else wasn't a stranger. It was the version of him that had always been waiting. Years of emotional detachment, a lifetime of compartmentalizing pain, rejection, and anger. Now converging into one singular controlled identity, devoid of empathy but rich in calculation. As Dr. Lewis noted in her clinical observations, Bundy likely experienced what she termed emotional dissociation, a defense mechanism where the mind disconnects from painful emotions to protect itself. But over time, that disconnect becomes permanent. And once that switch flips, the rules change. Bundy no longer needed to become someone else. He had quietly already arrived. The crimes would come later. But the man who would commit them, he was already gone. Before the first disappearance, before the first headline, before the first courtroom sketch. There was a man walking among us whose mind was already somewhere else. Ted Bundy's pre-crime psychology is a case study in cognitive disconnection. Outwardly, he was the picture of composure. Clean-cut, educated, polite. He made conversation easily and navigated social settings without suspicion. But inside, a quiet recalibration was taking place. not just of morality, but of meaning. Bundy began to rationalize his thoughts. He created internal justifications for the fantasies he harbored, dividing the world into those who mattered and those who didn't. He saw people not as individuals, but as objects, things he could control, manipulate, use, and erase. His worldview became utilitarian, relationships became tools, empathy became weakness. According to Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist and criminal behavior expert, Bundy exhibited classic traits of malignant narcissism, a dangerous blend of grandiosity, manipulation, and a complete lack of remorse. This wasn't a man losing control. It was a man gaining control of a new internal system that gave him permission to act without conscience. And what's perhaps most chilling, Bundy knew what he was becoming. He simply didn't care.
Or maybe on some level, he welcomed it.
Because for him, power was no longer an ambition. It was a need.
And that need was growing.
After the first crime, some people panic. Some feel guilt. Some fall apart. Ted Bundy didn't. He stayed calm, collected, composed. To the outside world, he seemed unchanged. But in truth, something had shifted irreversibly. Bundy didn't see his actions as crimes. He saw them as acts of control. Moments where he could rewrite the power dynamics that once made him feel small. And once the first act was done, his mind didn't recoil. It normalized the behavior. This is where cognitive distortion took over. He wasn't hurting people, he was expressing something. He wasn't evil, he was different. He wasn't broken, he was exceptional. Over time, the gap between action and emotion only widened. Bundy didn't confess. He denied. He lied effortlessly. He misled investigators and charmed reporters. He even represented himself in court. According to Dr. Stephen Michaud, who conducted in-depth interviews with Bundy, the killer displayed hallmark signs of compartmentalization, the ability to separate his violent actions from his public persona so thoroughly that he could function as two different people without visible cracks. Friends described him as oddly relaxed, even when under investigation. He wasn't just escaping consequences, he was rewriting the narrative in his own mind. For Bundy, there was no moral collapse after the crimes. There was only reinforcement that he could get away with anything, that he was smarter, stronger, untouchable, and perhaps that he was finally becoming the man he always thought he should be. Ted Bundy's story isn't just about what he did, it's about what we didn't see. Or perhaps, what we didn't want to see. He didn't fit the stereotype. He wasn't visibly angry. He wasn't disheveled or deranged. He was charming, intelligent, helpful. And that's what makes his case so important, because it challenges us to look deeper. Bundy's psychological transformation didn't begin with crime. It began with silence, with buried shame, with unmet emotional needs, and unrecognized distortions in his thinking. So what can we learn? Early signs often hide in plain sight. An inability to connect, a growing pattern of manipulation, a lack of empathy that escalates over time.
Mental health matters early and often. We must create environments where emotional struggles are not punished or ignored, but seen, named, and supported.
Intervention doesn't start with punishment. It starts with awareness, with listening, with asking uncomfortable questions when someone begins to retreat from empathy or reality. According to the American Psychological Association, early support for personality disorders, trauma recovery and emotional regulation in young adults can significantly reduce long-term risks, especially when paired with family or peer awareness. And finally, we need to break the myth of the monster, not to excuse behavior, but to understand that many individuals who do terrible things were once children in pain, long before they ever caused it. Because when we humanize the pathway, not the crime, we give ourselves the tools to intervene before it's too late. Ted Bundy's story didn't begin with violence. It began with confusion, with emotional distance, with the quiet unraveling of a mind no one fully understood until it was far too late. What makes his case so chilling isn't just what he did. It's how long he passed as normal, how long he wore the mask, And behind that mask was a man whose sense of self was built on rejection, resentment, and control, layered over with charm, intelligence, and image.
He wasn't a monster in the shadows. He was a reflection of what can happen when pain goes unheard and when mental illness is ignored or misunderstood.
His story is not about glorifying a killer. It's about understanding a person before they became one.
As psychologist Dr. Al Carlisle once said,
If we can't understand how people like Bundy are created, we can't hope to prevent others from following the same path. So now we ask you, what signs would you recognize today that you might have missed yesterday? Who in your life might be struggling quietly behind a smile? This video was made to open that conversation with empathy, with responsibility, and without judgment.
if you found this story thought-provoking, please consider
Liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, subscribing to this channel for more insight-driven psychology content, sharing it with someone who might benefit from understanding these complex silent transformations. Because sometimes the worst crimes begin not with hate, but with silence, fear, and unheard pain.